Hello, everyone. I hope that we're all doing okay out there. Um, Today, we're going to be starting a new chapter, chapter 21. This will be covering the different types of ecosystems that exist on Earth. This chapter will be broken up into two parts. So, we're going to focus on part one this week. We'll go through all of the land ecosystems, and you guys will have a few assignments with it. I'll also be sending you the PowerPoint for the entire chapter this week that you can use for assignments both this week and next week. Next week, we'll be covering part two, which will go over the water ecosystems, and we'll have a separate video for that. So let's get started with our land ecosystems. Before we get started, I have a little question for you to think about. This question asks, which of the following shows the organizational level of a biome from the broadest or biggest category to the most specific or the smallest category? So these are things that we've been talking about throughout this year. We should have a pretty decent idea about how to answer this, but let's talk about these choices. First of all, we see that every choice begins with the biome, and we know the biome is the broadest, biggest category of organization. A biome such as the desert or the tropical rainforest talks about a really, really big area that contains multiple ecosystems. So our biggest category would be the biome. And then moving down to the next smallest would actually be the ecosystem. Biomes are going to be made up of several ecosystems that may be similar. As we go to the next smallest level, it would be the community. The community includes all of the living things in the area. So all of the organisms you might find, for example, in a tropical rainforest. The next smallest would be the population, which would include all of the members of one species living in an area. And then the smallest would be the organism, which is just going to be one type of living thing. So for our answer for this question, our answer would be B. Okay, that would be the correct answer of largest to smallest. So biome, ecosystem, community, population, and then the smallest level would be the organism. So when we talk about a biome, these are large regions that have a similar climate, and they're usually made up of a number of smaller but related ecosystems within them. So we see a map here of all of the continents and all of the land biomes laid out. We can see on North America where we live in the biome called the temperate deciduous forest. There are many other land biomes, as you can see. We have the deserts, we have savannas, we have the tundra, grasslands, tropical rainforest. A lot of these you have probably talked about before and learned some things about before. Biomes may exist in more than one location on Earth, but the location is going to have a similar climate. For example, we have a desert that exists in North America. We also have deserts that exist in Africa. Those deserts, even though they are in different places on Earth, their climate is going to be similar, very, very hot and dry. So we'll start with the coldest biome first, the coldest land biome, which is the tundra. So very, very cold, largely treeless because it's so cold that trees don't grow very well there. There's not a lot of liquid precipitation, not a lot of rain, so big plants don't do well in these areas. However, you can get some small plants. These areas are going to have a lot of permafrost. This is permanently frozen soil that exists underneath the surface. So it could be frozen for several feet down, and it's going to be frozen year round. And these areas exist way up in the northern parts of Canada, up in Alaska, up towards where we have our Arctic regions. So very, very cold areas. All of the animals that live there have adaptations to deal with the very, very cold environment. The plants are usually very small and slow growing, like different types of grasses or moss. The growing season in this area is pretty short. There's probably only a short amount of time each year where things can grow, where the weather gets a little bit warmer and there might be, some sun and some precipitation to help the plants grow. There are going to be few nutrients in the soil due to these low temperatures as well. So when things die, like in our area, when animals die, they decompose fairly quickly and their nutrients gets returned back to the soil. In the tundra, it's so cold that these organisms don't break down very quick at all, and their nutrients gets locked up. So that deprives the soil of nutrients that it would be getting if these organisms were dying in a warmer area. It's sort of like having something in your refrigerator. For example, if you have like apples and you put them in the fridge, they're going to last a lot longer in your fridge than they would sitting out on your countertop. Our next type of biome is the tropical forest, and these occur near the equator, and we can see some pictures of some organisms we might find in these areas. Tropical frogs are a big one. Um, Plant life is going to be all over the place in these areas because they get a lot of sunlight, they get a lot of rain. It's great for plants to grow. They have pretty stable temperatures. It's pretty warm, pretty humid all year round in these areas, which is great for plant growth. They have abundant amounts of rainfall, so lots of rain throughout the year, much more than we would get in our area. They usually have two seasons, a wet season and one season that's a little bit drier. They have the highest species richness of all biomes. If you remember back, species richness is the number of different species that an area has. So the tropical forests, they have the largest number of different species. So many different species of plants, um, insects, frogs, lizards, salamanders, birds. It's you can't even count how many different species there are in these areas. We're still discovering new ones as we go through each year. There are two types of tropical forests. You might not have heard too much about tropical dry forests, but these ones have longer dry seasons during which some of the trees actually lose their leaves. The tropical rainforest, that's probably the one you've heard more about. They're more common. We find these in places like South America, Africa, Asia. These have very, very long wet seasons, and they have very tall trees and plants that grow year round. There's so much plant life in some of these areas that you could be walking through the tropical rainforest during the day, and it might look pretty similar to night because all the plant life has blocked out the sun. Very, very dense areas. Since there is so much plant life in these areas, competition for light is intense. Sometimes plants have to grow over top of each other to get enough sunlight. Also in the tropical rainforest, we have something called the canopy, which is this continuous layer of treetops which shade the forest floor. So you have all of the plants and trees that are growing so close together that not a lot of sunlight gets through. We can see in this picture up towards the top, there's not a lot of space between those trees where sunlight's going to get through. So that's called the canopy. There's another picture up towards the top right of the canopy. You can see all those leaves up towards the top blocking out a lot of the sunlight. You might have heard of the word jungle being used before. This usually refers to the dense growth found along riverbanks and in disrupted areas where sunlight can reach the forest. So a lot of our jungle areas, they're going to be near rivers where sunlight is reaching the floor of the forest and we can have even more growth and more animal life showing up. One type of organism that often shows up in these tropical rainforests is something called an epiphyte. These are going to be small plants that live on the branches of tall trees. They'll use those tall trees to their advantage as a place to grow, and these epiphytes will produce their own food. Examples of epiphytes include mosses, orchids, which look like a type of flower, and bromeliads, which are another type of plant epiphyte that can live on tops of trees. Our next type of biome is the temperate forest. This occurs in eastern North America, where we live, and also in western and central Europe and northeastern Asia. These places have distinct seasons. So, for example, in our area, we know that we have 4 seasons. Some places, like the tropical rainforest, only had like 2. So, we usually have 4 seasons in these areas. The climate is going to be moderate. That means it's not going to be super, super hot, and it's not going to be really cold for a long period of time. The temperature tends to be kind of in the middle a lot. Um, we have times in the winter where it does get cold for a few days, like really cold, but it usually doesn't stay really cold for like months on end, and it doesn't really usually stay super, super hot for months on end. A lot of times, if you average our temperature throughout the year, it might be in the 60s and 70s. That's a moderate climate. These temperate forests are going to be characterized by the type of tree that is most common in the area. And there are 2 types of temperate forests. We'll have the deciduous forests and the coniferous forests. And we'll talk about each of those on our next slide. The temperate deciduous forest is the biome where we live. So these pictures should look familiar to you because they contain plant life and animal life that we see a lot in our area, like the white-tailed deer, squirrels. The picture in the top middle of all those trees changing during the fall. It's something that I know we see a lot in our areas, especially around our mountains. These types of trees in our area, they lose all of their leaves in the fall and regrow them in the spring. Those are the deciduous trees. The only trees in our area that don't are the evergreen trees, the pine trees that we see in the lower right picture. We have pronounced precipitation, with precipitation being unevenly distributed through the years. So, um, in the spring and in the winter, we usually have more precipitation than we have in the summer and the fall. So we have times of the year where we do get more rain and we do get more snow. Our trees have broad, thin leaves with large surface areas. This is to capture large amounts of sunlight so that the trees can grow and make their food. Large areas in the temperate deciduous forest have been cut down for timber or cleared for human homes and habitation, like houses and also things like um, factories and shopping centers. We've cut down some of the forest. So some of this deciduous forest is not existing where it used to be. Some of it's been cleared away, and that can have bad effects on the environment and the wildlife in our area. The next biome we have is called the taiga. This is a forested biome that's dominated by coniferous trees. These are trees like the pine trees that will keep their leaves all year round. We have some other names for this that you might hear. It might be called the boreal forest, and some scientists call this the temperate coniferous forest. So in these areas, the place that's closest to us is in Canada. Most of Canada is going to be taiga. We can see some of the wildlife that exists there, lots of pine trees, things that have to be able to deal with not as much sunlight and some colder temperature. We see the wolf on this slide. We see moose. Those are some good examples of animals that can live in these areas. These areas have long winters with snow covering and insulating the ground. This actually helps to protect the tree roots so that the trees don't die off during these long winters. Plants in these areas are adapted for these very long, cold winters, along with the short summers and nutrient-poor soil. So basically, pine trees in these areas, they're able to be one of the only types of trees that grow in that area. They can deal with these conditions. These trees have waxy, needle-shaped leaves that remain on the tree all winter long. They're adapted against water loss. You think about in the winter time, these trees are not going to be getting a lot of rain. It's mostly snow. They can't use that snow inside of the tree, so they have to make sure that they keep whatever liquid water they have on the inside of that tree all winter long. So those needles help to prevent water loss. They're very, very small, so only a little bit of water is going to be leaving throughout those needles. And those needles also have a waxy covering, which helps protect water from being lost from those needles as well. Our next type of land biome is the grassland. Obviously, given the name, the plant life that shows up most in this area is different types of grasses. So we can see in these pictures here, we have very, very large areas made up of mostly grass, lots of vegetation for different types of organisms that live in the prairies to eat. In the North America uh, location, we call these prairies. In Asia, these are called the steppes. In South America, they call these the pampas, and in Africa, they call these the veldts, but they all have a similar type of climate that is mostly going to be for grasses and things that eat grasses in that area. Temperate grasslands usually form in the interior of continents with rainfall patterns that make these areas too dry to support trees. So we don't usually see a lot of trees in these areas, but we do see a lot of grass. Temperate grasslands are actually the type that we have in Central America, Central North America, I should say. These have rich, fertile soil that we can grow lots of crops in. So a lot of our farmland in America is going to be considered temperate grassland. These areas can support large herds of grazing animals like buffalo and cows. These areas can survive repeated grazing and fires because the actively growing part of the plant is at or below underground. So these grasses, where they're actively growing is really low to the ground. So any damage that happens to the top of these plants usually doesn't affect the rest of that grass. A savanna, this is going to be a tropical or temperate grassland that has scattered deciduous trees and shrubs. So we can see in these areas here, some of these savannas, they look like something you would see in The Lion King, where you have different types of animals like giraffes and ostriches and lions and zebras existing in these areas. They have more rainfall than deserts, so not a lot of sand in these areas, lots of grass and some trees. They have alternating wet and dry seasons. So they'll have a wet season with a lot of rain, followed by a dry season where they might not get much rain at all. So some organisms might have to move to places where there's more water during the dry seasons. Some trees will shed their leaves during the dry season. So once again, some of the food goes away. However, these areas do support a large number of herbivores, plant eaters, and carnivores, meat eaters. The chaparral is a biome dominated by dense, spiny shrubs and scattered clumps of carnivorous trees. We have this in California in America. California is a pretty big state, and much of California is going to be chaparral. They have mild, rainy winters, so not really much snow, a little bit cooler, some rain. And then they have hot, dry summers with periodic fires. So we're familiar with California having, fires every year. They are getting worse due to the changing of our climate. California is getting hotter, it's getting drier, it's allowing those fires to spread more quickly and be more dangerous. These chaparrals are found mainly in coastal settings by the ocean. The ocean helps affect the weather in these areas, the mild, kind of dry, breezy areas that we find the chaparral being in. Our last biome on land is the desert. I think you guys are pretty familiar with what these areas look like. They're very, very dry, not a lot of plant life, mostly sand. However, some small shrubs, some grasses, things like a cactus, they can live there. These areas receive an average of less than 10 inches of rainfall per year, so not a lot of rain at all. We have areas of desert in the southwest of the United States, like around Texas and Nevada, New Mexico. There are some deserts called a cold desert, which are hot in the summer, but very, very cold in the winter. Those would be the types of deserts we find in the Great Basin and Gobi Desert in Africa. Vegetation is going to be very, very sparse and consist of plants that have waxy coatings, like the cactus. Animals that can live in this area, they avoid heat during the day by hiding or burrowing and maybe coming out only at night. For example, snakes that live in this area, they might burrow under the sand. We have a picture over to the right of this slide of an organism coming out of a giant, kind of almost like cave in the ground. That animal is called a fennec fox. It's adapted for the desert by living mostly underground during the day, avoiding the heat. When it does come out, it has these very, very large ears that help to get rid of a lot of body heat so that the fennec fox doesn't overheat and die in this very, very hot conditions. So deserts, they don't have a lot of life that lives there because it's very, very harsh. The things that do live there have to be very well adapted to those very hot and dry conditions. Finish out with one question about our land biomes. It says, which choice below lists the biomes in order from lowest precipitation amounts to highest precipitation amounts? So take a moment here and see what do you think is going to have the lowest precipitation and what do you think is going to have the highest precipitation. We're looking for an order. When we think about this, the desert is going to have the lowest. So it's going to have to be between A and C because they both start with the desert. And the best answer between those is actually going to be C. The desert will have the lowest, and then the next lowest would be the grasslands. They'll have some rain, but not a lot. Only grass can really grow there. Then the next highest amount of precipitation will be the temperate deciduous forest. So that's where we live. We get a good amount of rain, but not quite as much as the tropical rainforest, which would have the highest amount. So those are some questions you could expect to see maybe on some assignments throughout this chapter, talking about the precipitation you might find in these areas, what the temperature might be like, or what the wildlife might be like that you find there. So that wraps up our first part of chapter 21, and you'll have some assignments about this in your Google Classroom.